Okay, welcome to our new lecture. This is a lecture on John Locke. I title this lecture The Mask of Human Reason and the Consolation of Modern Restlessness, and hopefully that title will become intelligible to you by the time we're done with this lecture. So, a few preliminary reflections, and I will put forward a thesis. So I have an interpretation of the history of philosophy and the history of modern philosophy. Different philosophy professors and historians of ideas will give you different takes on this history, and here's mine. Machiavelli's project incorporated two parts. First, he sought to demolish the Christian civilization, extolling the virtues of gentleness, tenderness, and mercy in favor of the brutal ruthlessness of the ancients. Now, we haven't studied Machiavelli, but this program is carried out principally in two works. The most popular is called The Prince. That's meant in a way as a kind of introduction to Machiavellism. And the second is the Discourses on Livy. That's the more serious treatise. There's no doubt that he is. There's a unanimous agreement that he is effectively praising the means of fraud and violence as legitimate means to achieve political ends in the sphere of the political. Okay. So his reason was the belief, right? His reason for wanting to effectively put an end to medieval and Renaissance Christian Europe and inaugurate a new historical epoch. His reason was his motivation, right? Was the belief that cruelty generates peace, whereas mercy promotes social disorder and ultimately war. Okay? So if you want to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs, and only persons who are willing to do that can actually establish a stable political order. Those who prefer to follow the counsel of Christian mercy tend to promote public disorder. Now, clearly he's an atheist, right? He doesn't believe that if you follow the counsels of Christian mercy that God is going to have your back, right? So he just denies that. So second, the demolition accomplished. Once that's accomplished, he sought to establish new modes and orders. That's his phrase, by the way, at the beginning of the Discourses on Livy. Based on these new modes and orders, based on national unity, so nationalism, okay, and republicanism. That is, every social class effectively participates in one manner or another in political power. It can be limited participation. It might take the form of having a right to sit in the jury on a jury trial, something to that effect, and no more, right? Normally having some sort of representative being able to present himself to the sovereign authority, whoever that is, and to have one's interests expressed to him. And incidentally, historically, it's just been understood that the sovereign power in a particular territory, the sovereign power of a state, has an interest in hearing, being acquainted with, actually being a master of the interests of the people whom he governs, even if they don't have the right to vote. Correct? He needs to know, right? If you're a farmer, guys, you need to know how your pigs are doing, how your cows are doing, right? How the chickens are doing, and you need to minister to their interests. This is obvious, right? So even if you're a tyrant, you need to know the legitimate interest of your people so you can minister to them. Okay, so that's just common sense, and it's universally acknowledged. So but in republicanism, we take that a step further, and we do allow every class of citizen or subject. Well, in this case, it's a citizen. Excuse me, I shouldn't say the word subject. In a republic, we're talking about a citizen. Okay, and monarchies and tyrannies, we're talking about subjects, and you could talk about subjects also in an oligarchy or an aristocracy. In a republic, you definitely have citizens, and they have access to power. That's what it is to be a citizen. Okay, is to participate in state power in some way, some significant way. So this was an attempt by Machiavelli at resurrecting Republican Rome, but now, as it were, with a new body, one different, perhaps stronger than the old body. So it's going to be a revamped Roman republicanism, one adapted to the needs of his time and future times. So now Descartes, I didn't mention this before, but you should know this. Descartes actually did read Machiavelli, And in response to Machiavelli's publication, he read at least The Prince. Descartes produced the bon mot, the witticism, that in The Prince he found nothing bad. Now, if you read through The Prince, it's all murder and mayhem from page 1 to the end. So otherwise put, Descartes agreed that politics requires a kind of brutality and that a certain impetuosity is necessary to conquer fortune. That's Machiavelli's term, actually, fortuna, the goddess Fortuna. But fortune stands in place of nature. If we're to conquer nature, right, we have to conquer what, from our point of view, happens to us significantly by chance. Hurricane Helene and Milton and so on and so forth. These people are saying that these were caused by cloud seeding. Well, let's look at the evidence. Surely, the vast majority of things that happened in the sphere of nature, earthquakes and tornadoes and things of that sort, those happen by chance, right? And so we need to establish a society and a technology by means of which we can protect ourselves from nature and maybe even grab hold of it, make it work for us. So to complement Machiavelli's Republican political foundations, which are understood as a protection against nature and as a way of getting hold of nature, particularly human nature, by the way, and using it in order to satisfy human desires and needs. Descartes, as this complement, right, he proposed a new scientific and technological project, drop the G, modeled on pure mathematics. So the way I read this, Descartes understands himself or understood himself as complementing Machiavelli. Okay. So preliminary reflection of thesis 2. Hobbes revises Machiavelli's project. This is the next thinker we should look at, right? Who we have studied. In a more, if I had a little bit more time, if I had more like a semester and a half, we would do Francis Bacon. So Hobbes revises Machiavelli's project by attempting to smuggle a Trojan horse into the citadel of English Protestant civilization and transform the latter from within by reducing its Christianity to a mere civil religion, that is, a political religion, okay? Political religion that serves the purpose of maintaining political stability, public welfare, okay? And the civil religion would be taught under the authority of the sovereign power, okay? The sovereign would determine its content. The sovereign would have the right to abolish whole books of the Bible, right? You follow? If the sovereign, after due deliberation, and of course they would have to play to the sensibilities of the subjects under the power of the sovereign, but after due deliberation and after they managed to trot out some official state theologians, and maybe it would take, maybe a 3, 4, 5-year program in doing this, put forward arguments to the effect that the book of Ecclesiastes is not genuine, they would remove it from the canon. You follow what I'm saying? And even with the remaining books, they would use their theologians to interpret every single sentence in the Bible and to make those interpretations official and required. And you would have to assent to them, okay? At least publicly. What happens in the confines of one's skull, that's one's own business. But publicly, one would have to give assent to those. That's Hobbes' mission. That's Hobbes' vision there. You're saying that sounds like a totalitarian state of some sort? Well, yes and no. With respect to religion, there's one option. With respect to economic activity, it leans towards economic liberalism. Okay. So now we turn to Locke. Locke is, as a political philosopher, in effect, the second revision of Machiavelli. And as an epistemologist, that means a student of knowledge. He's the first revision of Descartes. He's also a metaphysician of a modest sort. So as an epistemologist and a metaphysician, a student of what knowledge is, what we can know, and the grounds upon which we can know it, and as a metaphysician, a student of reality, right? What is really real, as I put it early in the course, and how we can know it, of course, in an attempt to justify opinions concerning what is really real. He is the first, or one of the first revisions of Descartes. Descartes has several people who follow up on him. And Locke is independent in this regard, okay? So whereas Hobbes' contempt for the actual truth claims of all religions is very thinly disguised. It's pretty obvious if you read through the Leviathan. With Locke, the disguise is, let me suggest, complete. By means of Locke, his whole life long, invoked the Bible, claimed he was a Christian, attended church service, even wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity. But okay, I'm trying to make you people sophisticated. You have to look at the actual title of that book. Okay, The Reasonableness of Christianity. What's reasonableness, and what is the standard of reasonableness? What are the criteria by means of which we distinguish what's reasonable from what's unreasonable? Okay, is Locke submitting himself to the revealed truths of Holy Writ, or is John Locke subordinating or submitting the truths putatively, right, communicated in the Bible, to his own intelligence, his own grasp of evidence, his own mastery of logic for a purpose of determining whether or not Christianity is reasonable or unreasonable, and then arriving at a carefully constructed argument that in fact it is reasonable, and that reasonable people can ascribe to it. Now, perhaps so long as they interpret it the way that he does. And he goes on quite at length criticizing persons who have an unreasonable, in his estimation, an unreasonable interpretation of Christianity. Okay, so I can't get into this at length in this course, but I would suggest that the unreasonable people are individuals who, from his point of view, spend too much time reading the book of Daniel and the book of the Apocalypse and the Old Testament prophets. Okay, and maybe spending too much time thinking about the prophecy of Matthew 24. Basically, those who spend too much time thinking about Apocalypse, the end of the world, the last judgment, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, effectively, the four last things. Maybe study demonology, things of that sort, angelology. And Catholics, forget about it, right? From his point of view, maybe they're involved in idol worship and stuff like that. So, though he is a Church of English guy, so we have to be careful on that one. So, that's what I have to say about that, I guess. Let's see. So I have a sentence there in the slides. I more or less said what more fully what I say there. So next bullet point. And whereas Hobbes wrote with a vigorous English style praised to this day, Locke adopted an easy and limpid, that means clear, okay, an easy and limpid prose that itself became a model for a future British philosophical, for all future British philosophical writing. All right, so Locke he's a stylist of note, and people imitate him. And it's impossible to write within philosophy in English, particularly in Great Britain, unless you're kind of, you're operating within the stream that he opened up, as it were. Okay. But the clarity of his prose, I submit, is, can I suggest, maybe it's a strong word, but I'm going to say it anyway. The clarity of his prose is, I submit, a kind of mask, a mask deliberately donned to seduce a generation of readers into adopting his reasonings as not merely easy and natural, but here's a key word, as sufficient on their own to declare all that can be known, not merely about rights, law, polity, and human knowledge, but also about faith as well. Okay? So I taught the reasonableness of Christianity to a group of prisoners in medium security in Cranston. And by the time we were done with that thing, John Locke had practically established his own Church of John Locke right there in medium security. And then we evaluated some of his interpretations, and there are the obvious questions you can raise about it, and I think there are parts of it that are false, but you go ahead and read it and arrive at your own opinion. Hence, his reasonableness of Christianity, the principal thesis of which is that Jesus studiously avoided declaring himself to be the Messiah during his 3-year ministry, is in effect a continuation and perfecting of Hobbes' project to domesticate Christianity. Okay? Now, you're at a bit of a disadvantage here because you haven't read the reasonableness of Christianity. But hopefully I'm putting a little fire in your belly here, and you're saying to yourself, I don't want to just be led around by Dr. Shikiar, so I'm going to read that book. Do it, okay? And then send me an email and tell me what you think. So his seemingly moderate political program, one based on the radical innovation of deriving all positive rights and duties from a contract, arrived upon in the state of nature, and defending the radical thesis that the subjects of a monarch have a right to revolution, which is where he arrives. This, in fact, continues Machiavelli's and Hobbes' revolution in political theorizing, while quelling some of the disorderly passions one encounters in their writing, and putting to ease its restless spirit. Locke is, as it were, the model of reasonableness. There are no excited passions in John Locke, even though he will endorse a right on the part of the people to revolt and depose a sitting monarch, as the English people had recently done in 1651, when they removed Charles I from power and decapitated the man. All right. So that's why I'm saying you have to be able to think not merely two things at once that are in tension with one another, but three or four or five or six or seven things at once that are in tension with one another in order to do any real thinking. And most persons, they don't want to think relationally. Most persons think dyadically. They think, one or another, and I'm gonna grab this one: Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And either Trump's right about everything or Kamala Harris is right about everything. I'm gonna pick one or the other. Well, how about, looking at the full range of political positions out there? Both of those persons are being promoted by certain interests behind them. Even Trump, who gets championed as a kind of anti-establishment person. And you have to really study the scene carefully in order to get an actually informed set of opinions concerning the range of interpretations for interpreting our present social and political reality and the various sorts of policy proposals being put forward, and the whole array of epoch-sized problems we're confronting right now, and so on. I could do a whole course on that, and they don't pay me to do that sort of thing, so oh well. The person, the man, and the soul. Let's get right into John Locke now. Let's get right into his doctrines. The background of John Locke's political philosophy is his theory of what it is to be a person and a man. There's a distinction there for him. He arrives upon this distinction through a consideration of Descartes' position that the essence of the soul is the act of thinking. You recall that from the Descartes lecture and from your reading. So Locke rejects Descartes' theory of the soul. Let's see how he does that. He offers a number of arguments. I'll give you the one that's probably most convincing. For if the essence of the soul were the act of thinking, then the soul would always be thinking, right? Because if something belongs to your very essence, okay, then that thing has to be true of you so long as you exist, right? If it belongs to the very essence of you as a member of the species Homo sapiens sapiens, we do repeat the sapiens, by the way, then so long as you exist, that has to be true of you. Like, for example, it is true of you that you ought to act rationally. Whether you're acting rationally or irrationally, you ought to act rationally, right? That's true of members of the species Homo sapiens sapiens. So that's true of you all the time. If it belongs to the very essence of the soul, that it be thinking, if thinking, not just the capacity, but the act of thinking belongs to its essence, the soul has to be continuously thinking. Okay. Even when you're asleep. Okay, that's where Locke begins to see a problem. So assuming the soul was thinking while one slept, one must hold that it thought, that means received, if you like, his word is received, ideas during that time. It doesn't make any difference whether it thought ideas during that time or received ideas during that time and then thought them. It thought them one way or another, right? Okay, either through reception or some other means. But if the soul has the power to think ideas at a time, then surely it has the power to preserve a memory of those same ideas which it previously thought. Okay? And yet, no one has ever experienced a memory of what his soul was thinking the last time he slept. It's never happened. There's no report of this ever in any literature or orally by anyone in all of human history. If there was such a report, it hasn't come down to us. But people report many things, and sooner or later, right? some report of that species should be able to be discoverable somewhere, and none has been discovered. Therefore, the soul is not identical with the act of thinking. Okay, because if it were identical with the act of thinking, people would at least occasionally remember what they were thinking when they were asleep. Doesn't happen. So Descartes wrong. The man and the person. Having dispensed with the soul, Locke states that most people's idea of a man is of a thinking being joined to a body so-and-so shaped. He says this in Essays on Human Understanding, which generally I'm relying upon right now. That's book 2, chapter 27, line 8. But he goes on to distinguish a man from a person. Okay? A man is a biological entity in which reason is present in a human body. That's true of a 7-year-old. But a person is a man. He uses the word man to include women. But this is the 17th century, guys. Don't get angry at him. This is how things were done back then. But a person is a man in whom reason has been developed in a definite way so as to produce a self conscious of himself as a responsible agent. That phrase gets right to the heart of it. A self conscious of himself as a responsible agent, someone who takes responsibility for his choices, for his actions, therefore, right? For the opinions he adopts. You get that? Okay. For Locke, the whole aim of education is to develop a boy. He was focused on the male sex. There's some historical reason for this. He was in correspondence with a Clark family. They were raising their boy, and they were asking John Locke for advice on how to raise him. And through this correspondence, John Locke, at least in part through this correspondence, John Locke developed an entire, very famous philosophy of education, which is actually it's very, very much worth reading. He gives some pretty solid principles, in my opinion. And you might look at it. It's called On Education by John Locke. So when you start your own family, or if you have one, you can look at that. Like, he's against corporal punishment and stuff like that. He's against simply dictating moral rules to children. He counsels that you lead children by example. They need models, and they need to be trained in virtue. You have to give them opportunities to practice virtuous actions so they get in the habit of doing it and not doing vicious actions. So for him, education is really about building moral character, because unless you have a person who has good moral character, they're not going to love truth. And if they don't love truth, it doesn't matter how much logic you teach them, they'll end up misusing it. Okay, well, you see that a lot. Like, for example, in all these sort of fraudulent studies they have published backing this or that particular industry, we have our genuine experts who are unjust and dishonest. I think we talked about this earlier in the course. When you have an unjust, dishonest expert, it doesn't matter that they're an expert. You want to steer clear of these people because they use their expertise to fling dust in your eyes and to hypnotize you into adopting a conclusion and a course of action which is actually harmful to you. And it's beneficial to them because they make money from it. Okay. So for John Locke, the whole aim of education is to develop a boy into a person. So let's have a look more closely at what it is to be a person. I gave you a quick account. He goes into more detail. The person is an intelligent being conscious of itself as the same over time and in different places. And John Locke is very famous for his theory of personal identity. It's one of those locations in Locke's thought that people go back to again and again. It's studied every single semester in graduate programs all over the world, probably dozens of times. That's in his essay, section 9. The person is concerned for and sympathizes with its body and its parts. Section 11. The person is concerned with its actions and is accountable for them. The person is sensible of happiness and misery and believes there is something that is himself that he is concerned for and would have happy. Section 25. The person is concerned for self. Section 17. The person owns its actions and is capable of law, both natural law and positive law passed by human beings. Okay, I don't have this section for that. So now let's talk about personal identity specifically, right? That's important. Unless you have personal identity, you can't have your a consciousness of yourself as a responsible agent over time, so you won't take responsibility for what you did yesterday, okay, or the day before or last year. But in order for us to have actual persons, we have to have people who take responsibility for what they've done their whole life long, or at least from the point when they reached moral maturity. Like, I'm not going to take responsibility for what I did when I was 3, because I didn't have a developed moral faculty. I mean, in some sense, I was biologically responsible, but I didn't know the difference between right and wrong. Neither did you. But by age 15, I knew, right? So any bad choices I made at 15, even though I was relatively uneducated, I'm still responsible for them. Less so than now, if I were to make some of those same choices today, right? I mean, knowing what I know now, if I were to behave right now the way I behaved a few times when I was 15, boy, I'd be a lot more guilty, let me tell you. Okay, and likewise with you, okay? So, this consciousness of identity over time presupposes that perception is inherently reflective, and we can say, yeah, just let's say reflective. It, as it were, turns back on itself and is conscious of itself. One cannot perceive without perceiving that one is perceiving. That's characteristic of us. Probably, on the basis of the evidence we have, probably not of any animal at all. Maybe like dolphins and higher primates a little bit. That's a matter of vigorous dispute right now. I've actually read some literature on this, and there are people who are pro, and there are people who are con. The con people have good arguments. The pro people are still pushing for their desired conclusion. So thus, an experience of self and of the being, let's see, the experience of self and of being, the owner of one's experiences, is at the root of personal identity. Okay? So he writes, nothing but consciousness can unite remote existences into the same person. The identity of substance will not do it. All right? Nothing but consciousness can unite remote existences, so what happened yesterday and previous times, into the same person. It's your active memory of what you've done in the past and your act of taking responsibility for what you've done that unites you into a person. Now, the continuity of your substance, of your body endowed with the faculty of reason over that time, that's not enough. That's a necessary condition. It's a necessary condition. But the sufficient condition for being a person is to actually actively identify with those past acts. And if you say, well, maybe I can get out of it by, get out of something I did 10 years ago by just not identifying with it, well, that's self-deception, because in that very act, you're acknowledging you did it, and then you're trying to somehow deceive yourself into the belief you didn't do it so that you don't take responsibility for it. So that doesn't work. So now let's look at the relationship between moral philosophy and political philosophy. Moral philosophy articulates an account of the ends of human life, the moral rules that bind all persons, and the relation between these rules and these ends. Now, we saw in Aristotle, there's no detailed list of moral rules. There is no list of moral rules. But he, in effect, acknowledges that there are moral rules when he talks about the relationship between means and ends, and in his definition of virtue in Book 2, which we didn't read. It's just that moral rules aren't at the center. But by the time we get to the 17th century, and we're in a Christian tradition where we talk about the Ten Commandments, right? Here, there very definitely is a consciousness of moral rules, and that is, these are related to the ends of human life. So political philosophy depends upon the account provided by moral philosophy, and then works out rationally the ideal social and political structure within which the ends of man, their vocabulary, the ends of human beings, can best be attained in accordance with the moral rules articulated by moral philosophy. So, we have this idea of what the natural ends of the human being are. For St. Thomas Aquinas, it was perfect goodwill and wisdom. Those are the two ends. And how are we going to achieve those? Well, through the cultivation of virtue. And how do we get to the virtues? We get to those, we didn't study his moral doctrine, but we get to those through strictly adhering to the Ten Commandments. Okay? And then he would add in a theological mode the counsels of perfection, promptings of the Holy Spirit and stuff like that. Okay. So in Thomas Hobbes, the ends of man were comfort and, well, first self-preservation and then comfort. Okay? And so how do we get to comfortable self-preservation? We make an agreement with others to submit ourselves to a sovereign who then maintains law and order. And then with the law and order, we're greatly able to increase the probability of surviving and living out our natural term. And in addition, we get a certain amount of freedom within which to practice a trade or provide a service, and therefore live at a certain level of comfort, right? And so we end up with our ends of comfortable self-preservation. Notice that neither goodwill nor wisdom are natural ends from the standpoint of Thomas Hobbes, who effectively treats human beings as more or less very clever animals. And that's not a polemical point either, it's what he does. Okay. However, Locke never got beyond developing a sketch of a moral philosophy. This is a difficulty in the interpretation of Locke. He wanted to develop one. It seems like he couldn't do it. As for the good, he identifies it with pleasure and evil with pain. Well, that's interesting. So the good is pleasure and evil is pain. He would have to acknowledge that self-preservation is a good thing too. And supposedly, there's this ambiguity in Locke. Supposedly being a person is good, right? Having a certain level of moral maturity. This is the whole aim of education. Okay? So in his theoretical treatises, like when you turn to the essay on human understanding, there the good is pleasure and evil is pain. He has a little bit more of an expansive definition, but that's what it boils down to. When you turn to his book on education, he doesn't say that the aim and end of life is to be a person, that is to be a morally responsible agent, conscious of himself, is responsible for his choices, his actions, and his beliefs. He doesn't say that, but it surely looks that way when you read through that book. The whole point of education is to produce that product. That's the end, right? So there is that point of ambiguity. We should keep that in mind when reading his political philosophy. Because what's the aim and end of the civil state? Well, we can anticipate it's the protection of life, liberty, and property, right? But there's that word liberty. Life is self-preservation, right? Liberty, well, isn't that being a person? You can't be genuinely free unless you possess reason, because without reason, you can't face choices, evaluate them in the light of reasons, and choose that choice which is best justified in light of the reasons, that is, the evidence and the logical connections which you consider through the use of your rational faculties, suitably educated and brought up to a level of adult, mature competence. You guys follow? And as far as property, well, we think immediately of land, money, and holdings, objects. Later, he defines property as everything which we can say is mine, including yourself. All right. So there's that ambiguity. I wish I could say, I could resolve the ambiguity for you. It's just right there. Next bullet point. So Locke held that moral rules he held that moral rules are ideal objects of reason, like the definitions of geometrical figures. Okay. So here's the analogy. You can define what a triangle is. Okay, it's a closed figure composed of 3 straight lines. And once you have that definition, you can deduce all sorts of wonderful things about triangles, either from the standpoint of geometry or trigonometry. Okay, and that's that. And that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if there's ever been a triangle in existence in nature. Everything that looks like a triangle in nature is probably slightly defective, to be perfectly frank. And if we take a laser, measurement instrument and measure it, we'll find the defect. Who cares? From the standpoint of mathematics, we know what a triangle is. It's an ideal object, and we can deduce its properties with perfect necessity. Done. Likewise, one may in principle determine true and binding moral rules, even if no one has ever perfectly conformed to one. It says there are objects which are more or less perfectly in conformity with what it is to be a triangle, even though not one of them has ever been a triangle perfectly. So there are various actions which more or less conform to moral perfection, even if no one of them, with the exception of the actions of Jesus, have ever perfectly conformed. In Catholic saying St. Mary conformed to those rules too. So he never gets past his assertion. There's a typo there, pardon me. He never gets past his assertion that justifications can be given for the moral rules of Christianity. Let me explain that. Locke, he says we can take the moral rules of Christianity and we can find justifications for them. There's the whole ambiguity of Locke right there. You follow? So some will say, look, okay, Dr. Shikiyar, shut up. He's a Christian. He just said you can go into the Bible and find true moral rules. Yeah, but you can find true moral rules in the Quran. You can find them in other books. Okay, and right there in his reference to Christianity, he talks about offering rational justifications for those rules. That is not submitting oneself to God, but submitting God to one's own faculty of reason and determining, the justifications for those rules. And I mean, there's still a little bit of an ambiguity. I mean, what would he say about, the book of Joshua, where there's a genocide, effectively? Okay, that's a kind of tough pill to swallow for people and individuals. There are some very exotic interpretations of that. Even modern science admits there are multiple species of hominid, right? There's not just human beings, there are Neanderthals and a few others. If you look at the Bible, I mean, if you look at it strictly, let's give you a little biblical commentary here. It looks like what it's saying is that the people who inhabited ancient Canaan weren't human, right? And say, oh, it's racism. Maybe. But that seems to be the argument there, and that they weren't actually capable of a certain kind of goodwill. They were guilty of all these horrors like child sacrifice and stuff like that. Okay, I'm not going to tell you what to believe about that. I'm just going to point out what people are saying about it. All right, let's move on. Political philosophy. The background of his moral and political philosophy alike is his metaphysics and epistemology. For our purposes, it will suffice to state that he followed Descartes and Hobbes in rejecting final causes. That's the real big move of the 17th century. Rejecting final causes, and if you like, particularly with Descartes and his figure named Spinoza, I might redo the syllabus and fit him in, changing the idea of perfection from that of a thing achieving its end, its finality, to that of the mathematical perfection of nature, right? We saw that with Descartes. So the fact that Hobbes follows Descartes and Hobbes, rejecting final causes, that at least explains why when he's pressed and asked the question directly, he says that the good for him is pleasure and not virtue. Okay? So that seems to be his considered metaphysical opinion about the matter. But when you read through his letters and his biography, John Locke, he seems to have been, a sort of a decent fellow. Like he was concerned with moral rectitude and treating people decently and being a good fellow, right? And that's because he was raised in Christian England. And he was raised with the Bible and had imbibed the spirit of the gospel to some degree or another, right? We're supposed to live by the golden rule and act on the principle of holy charity and treat one another with tenderness and even sacrificial love. Okay, so by habit, he was certainly a person concerned with virtue, right? And that might explain his concern with virtue on education. And he was now torn, trying to work out a reconciliation between what he had learned as a kid and what his reason had arrived upon through studying, Descartes and Hobbes and people like that. I mean, that's sort of a quick thumbnail sketch of the sort of contradiction that John Locke was harboring within himself and he was trying to work out. And there's a thinker named Isaiah Berlin, like the city. He put forward the thesis, but I think there's a lot of merit to this thesis, that the great geniuses historically are persons who harbored contradictions. And a lot of people harbor contradictions, but the great geniuses in every case harbored great contradictions and worked out extraordinary, if not solutions, attempts at solutions to those contradictions. Okay? So that's the thesis is very much worth taking seriously. So next bullet point, Locke's political philosophy moderates and significantly alters that of Thomas Hobbes. So like Hobbes, Locke begins with the state of nature. So Locke is a state of nature theorist along with Hobbes. This is an innovation in the history of political philosophy. This is not how Aristotle taught political philosophy. For Aristotle, you begin with the mature state in its state of perfection. And unless you have an idea of a perfect state, you can't do political philosophy. You have to consider what the perfection of a state is, and then you can study the various inferior modalities or inferior species. So whereas Hobbes characterized the state of nature as a state of war, Locke denied this characterization. The state of nature, is not a state of war. Let's see if we can move this forward. Sorry, my slide appears to have, okay, frozen for a second there. There we go. So the law of nature and crime. So it is inevitable, however, that some human beings will violate the law of nature. It is precisely because of the equality of persons that any person can, in this state of affairs, assume the function of enforcer and agent of punishment, right? So we're all equal, born equal, equal rights. Someone violates the law, so I can take it upon myself to enforce it in the state of nature, because there is no political state. And the law of nature, it impresses itself upon the conscience. Okay, what's the law of nature? To harm no one. I thought I put it in here somewhere. Here, I'll tell you right now. The law of nature is to harm no one in their life, limb, liberty, or property. Living means health, right? Life, health, liberty, or property. Do not murder, do not injure, do not, without justice, restrict somebody's freedom, and do not steal. Okay, those four. And he also adds help whenever you can. When you can do so, help. Okay, sounds like moral common sense, doesn't it? He's reducing things down to their essential. Oh, by the way, he doesn't mention God in his law of nature, which is interesting. I'm not going to draw any inferences, but it's interesting. All right. So Locke goes very far. Let me back up for a second. So somebody violates that law in the state of nature. Who's going to apprehend the criminal and punish him? There are no police. There is no system of justice, no courts, no prisons. It's on you or somebody else. And because we're all equal, each person has because we're equal, we have the equal right to enforce the law of nature. Okay? All right. So Locke goes very far in assigning a right to administer punishment in the state of nature. This can go as far as the death penalty, and ought at least go so far as to establish a settled fear in the criminal of ever perpetrating the crime again. So Locke, he's not at all mild when he considers how to treat criminals in the state of nature. He uses very, very strong language, which you're familiar with because you read the passages. So note the absence of mildness, the biblical mildness that God directed against Cain. Why didn't God just smite Cain out of existence with a thunderbolt after Cain murdered Abel? It seems that if Locke had the opportunity, if he had a thunderbolt available and he were there, that's what he would have done. Okay. So there's a certain absence of, we can say this is uncontroversial, there's an absence of mercy in Locke's theory of crime and punishment. A difficulty arises with the observation that each person is naturally biased in his own favor and that of his friends. So natural bias, right? Isn't everybody, you've all had the experience where there was a dispute. You heard one person give you his side of the dispute, another person give you his or her side of the dispute, and they give completely incompatible stories. And it's always the case that the person telling you the story makes it such that he or she appears perfectly just and the other person perfectly unjust. But then the other person flips it and makes him or herself perfectly just, and other person perfectly unjust. That's natural bias in one's own favor, and likewise in the favor of one's friends. So this means that when administering punishment, this is the lesson he draws, in the state of nature, the punisher will tend to go to excess, right? Because he'll overestimate the damage that has been done to himself, and he will then conclude that a certain degree of punishment is merited. But that'll go beyond, go beyond what's strictly just, because he overestimated the damage done to himself, because he loves himself and takes any damage done to himself to be much more serious than damage done to another person. Because after all, he feels it, right? By the way, Locke doesn't mention that this natural bias can even motivate false accusations, I think, when people get a little bit sensitive. All right. But this means that even if the state of nature is not a state of war, it can nonetheless generate cycles of revenge, dangerous for all, right? Like two hillbilly families whittling away at one another until neither exists, or there are two guys left. Here we go. So now let's talk about natural law and natural rights. All we ever talk about here are human rights. In the old days, they talked about natural rights. And in John Locke, we find the foundation for this concept. So the solution to this difficulty of violence in the state of nature, so the state of nature is not a state of war, but it is tipped towards violence and conflict, right? So the solution arrives in the form of a multitude of persons freely agreeing to enter into a civil society. So we're familiar with this from Hobbes. But this involves electing a sovereign to lead them. And unlike Hobbes, for Locke, the sovereign is now party to the contract. For Hobbes, the sovereign's outside of the contract. So from the standpoint of the sovereign, for Hobbes, he's still in the state of nature, only now facing a group of individuals who have placed themselves under his authority. And if he's prudent, from Hobbes' point of view, that person, the sovereign, he's not going to clobber those people or kill all of them, take all their stuff and kill them. What he's going to do is he is going to set up a system of a political system, maintain law and order, and rather than rob them all at once, tax them every year indefinitely into the future. You see, that's the prudent thing to do from Hobbes' point of view. Very kind of hard-headed way of thinking. But for Locke, the sovereign is internal to the contract, right? And this produces not a liberal autocracy, as we saw in Hobbes, but rather a constitutional monarchy, a monarchy which is straightaway limited. So John Locke is historically the great theorist against absolute monarchy, a monarchy of unbounded authority. So the key is that the civil state exists for the sake of upholding and protecting a natural law that exists prior to it, and which one invokes even to justify the existence of the civil state. The moral authority of the civil state feeds on the natural law, or draws its sustenance from the natural law. The civil state is at root bound by the natural law, but therefore so is the sovereign. Okay, you see how the king, like King Charles now, is hemmed in by the natural law on this theory. So Locke spoke of law, but he didn't speak of natural rights, which Thomas Jefferson obviously did and is obviously central to our tradition here in the U.S. So nonetheless, Locke's followers would argue that the natural law implies what we call correlative rights. This is a big topic in philosophy of law courses and philosophy of law literature, the relation between effectively duties and rights. If you want to follow up on that, there's a fellow named, you look up the article, Natural Rights, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. You're going to learn a lot from that, okay? It's very lucidly written, develops a Hofeld scheme, H-O-H-F-E-L-D, Hofeld scheme. It changes the vocabulary, unfortunately, but it's a quick way in. So these rights are at least the following: the rights to life, liberty, and property, okay? Jefferson would later replace property with the pursuit of happiness. That's more of a literary flourish. It comes down to the same thing ultimately. For all intents and purposes, Locke is one of the principal moral pedagogues of the United States of America. Think about this. You're reading somebody who was virtually a founding father. In this regard, he may be grouped with Franklin, who taught Americans the values of industry and thrift. Read his autobiography. And Jonathan Edwards, the Congregationalist preacher and theologian. Okay, well, still the greatest teacher of religion in the Protestant tradition in the United States. Okay, legitimacy and consent. The civil state is just as much as Hobbes' Leviathan a human artifact, so does not, as for Aristotle, exist by nature. Okay, so for Aristotle, the state exists by nature. For the modern theorists like Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke, the state is a product of human contrivance just as much as a vacuum cleaner is. Okay, and we know what we make. So we make as a statement that Hobbes produced, we know what we make. So we make something, and since we made it to serve a certain purpose, we designed its parts, put them together, we know what we're talking about. So we know what the state is, and we have a perfect insight into it because we made it. You can challenge that and say, yeah, you can make something, but not really understand what the future implications, let's say 100 years down the road, are of what you've made. I think that's actually true. So I would qualify, I myself, having studied history, and you guys probably can pretty easily see that this idea that you know what you make has to be qualified. It's true to a point. All right. So the purpose of this state is ultimately to protect the rights of its subjects for Locke's state. But these subjects rather better resemble citizens in that the legitimacy of the state rests upon their consent. So I should probably just ambiguate there. For Hobbes, we have subjects. You vote your way, as it were, into the state, but once you're there, you're no longer a democratic citizen, you're a subject. Unless, of course, you establish a democracy. But Hobbes maintains the best form of government is a monarchy, second best is an aristocracy. Third best would be a democracy. Okay. But for Locke, you vote your way into the state and you preserve, as it were, the endowments of a democratic citizen, so to speak. The state is legitimate only insofar as the people under its authority consent to be governed by it. All right, so now we get this whole vocabulary of legitimacy and consent that we're so familiar with from our childhoods on, right? And John Locke is responsible for it. And the founders of the United States of America adopted Locke's moral vision and taught the rest of us now, to the tunes of hundreds of millions of people, to think this way. You don't have to think this way. You can think along with Chairman Mao and Xi Jinping, right? So we have billions of people, if you add them all up over history, who've thought that way. Okay. So now note that Hobbes conceived of the social contract as a one-way process out of the state of nature and into the commonwealth. Once having entered, it would be a violation of one's promise to attempt to withdraw from the contract. Locke argues against this by observing that as the state arises out of a democratic act, it can likewise be dissolved by a democratic act. Okay? However, with this act, citizens consent to give up their right to judge in their own cause. That's really key. I probably should have italicized that. When you enter into the state, what you're doing is you're giving up your right to act as an enforcer of the natural law. That's over with. The natural law will be affirmed in the positive law that will be established by the legislature, and the sovereign will function as the executive power, enforcing the law. And then there'll be a federative power. We didn't get to that, but there'll be a federative power that has to do with foreign policy. Okay, and what you do as a citizen, you give up that right, you hand it over to the state. So if there's a dispute between you and some other person, the person has committed a crime at whatever level, or you committed the crime, hopefully not, then we hand the matter over to the state, and they accumulate evidence. They set the system of justice in motion. They determine guilt or innocence. If innocence is determined, all parties go home. If guilt is determined, the person apprehended is then subject to a specified punishment, proportionate, we hope, to the measure of the crime. Crime is the measure of punishment, one says. So, however, this act of with this act, citizens consent. Oh, I said that. All right. So the state's the neutral arbiter between disputes between parties. All right. Let's move this forward. However, let's look at revolution now. Locke draws the ultimate lesson from his principles. The people have the right to revolution. This is what Thomas Jefferson. For Thomas Jefferson, Locke's one of his great heroes. He has three heroes: Francis Bacon for scientific method, John Locke, likewise for method and for epistemology and for his political philosophy particularly, and Sir Isaac Newton for his great scientific accomplishments. Everyone acknowledges those. So Jefferson will pick up this idea and say that the tree of liberty has to be watered periodically with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And this theory of revolution, formulated by John Locke and then recast rather poetically by Thomas Jefferson, is alive and well, and you can encounter it. Just get in a car and drive out to Michigan or anywhere in the Midwest. There must be a couple here, but you go to any of these places where you have any of these Christian patriot militias or just patriotic militias. That's how they're thinking, and they believe, rightly or wrongly, the government has become tyrannical and are prepared to use the means of violence to defend themselves against what they regard to be unjust aggression. Okay, so that's the world we're living in, guys, and it's always been that way. It'll never not be that way because that's our tradition. You got to look at that. It's built right into the very fabric of this country, that mentality, whether you like it or not. Some of you are fist pumping right now. Others of you are rolling your eyes. I'm not here to defend any particular political attitude. I'm here to teach you these philosophies and then to link what we learn here to our actual present experience. The thoughts of John Locke are pulsating live realities in the minds of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. Really hundreds of millions. We have 330 million in the country. Okay, so this right to revolution for Locke, however, is severely restricted. The restriction is based on Locke's earlier reflections on the nature of crime in the state of nature. There he stated that if another person were to subject one to his power for the purpose of robbing one, one would then be warranted in the inference that the robber might intend to kill one wholly. Like, why would someone put you under his power wholly unless he intended to use that power over you? When he places you under your power wholly, when he places you under his power wholly, excuse me, he has placed you under his absolute power, and that's the exact position which you can never tolerate from Locke's point of view. Okay, so in a word, absolute power justifies violent struggle. And you can see how this idea plays itself out in the U.S. in the form of the anti-slavery movement, more in the line of Frederick Douglass than William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison was not much of a violent struggle fellow, but he wanted through legislation to emancipate those persons in the U.S. who were enslaved. Frederick Douglass was quite happy with the Civil War. As a matter of fact, he rejoiced when it began, and was definitely absolutely 100% for violent struggle. All right, so this principle transfers to the political sphere, that your right to kill somebody who home invades you and places you under his absolute power, that transfers to the political sphere. If a man asserts that he has an absolute and unlimited right over one's life, liberty, and property, he calls himself king and submits millions of people to that claim. These people, even one of you, but a group of them have the right to resist and depose him. That's John Locke's teaching. And I think a lot of you are in agreement with that. So, okay, I can't read minds through a computer, but I'm guessing that if Joseph Stalin came into power in the United States and gamed the system and managed to make himself the absolute ruler and began organizing a gulag here and arresting his political enemies and having them liquidated and tortured and or sent off to the gulag for decades of hard labor, that some of you would say, yeah, things have gotten too far and it's time to do something. Okay. If things ever get that far, it'll be too late. So thus Locke introduced the theoretical underpinnings for modern revolutionary politics. Okay. The American colonists would act on this Lockean conception of revolution, of course. All right. Now let's turn to his doctrine of toleration. John Locke is credited with being the originator of the doctrine of religious toleration, built right into our First Amendment. Now see his letter concerning toleration. The concept of religious toleration is an extension of his concept of liberty, which itself is based upon his concept of the person, conscious of himself or herself as a rationally, that is morally and epistemically responsible agent across time. The basic thesis is that a government based upon the consent of the people is constrained to recognize the right of religious conscience, and that there is to be no law prohibiting practicing the Christian sect or the precursor Judaism of one's choice. I left that out. He has, in effect, two arguments for this conclusion. So he doesn't say anything about Islam, and we would think in the 17th century he would not have been receptive to it significantly because the Europeans had for centuries been at war with Muslim states. So first, it is impossible to use coercion to change a person's will and belief, understood as the product of a freely given assent or withholding of that assent to a religious doctrine. I mean, you can't enter into a person's will and compel them to assent to the truth that Muhammad is the last prophet or that Jesus is the Son of God. They either have to accept that or they don't, and it's through their own independent free choice that they do so. So that's the first point that John Locke makes concerning this doctrine of religious toleration. So second, it would be imprudent for any community of faith to force its beliefs on the whole of political society. For imprudence, this is an argument from prudence, for it is always possible that in the future the tables could be turned on one, and that group that had forced their beliefs on the rest of society, the rest of society or some subsection, force its beliefs on them. Okay? He says, think carefully. I mean, people get very passionate and they want to impose their opinions on people. That's happening today, right? Obviously. And then the question is that really a good idea? And John Locke says absolutely 100% no. So one should note that this doctrine is compatible even if in tension with the existence of a confessional state. The Church of England, may be the official church of Great Britain, and there can be a law protecting the practice of other religions. Okay? Likewise, this may have changed, and I was trying to look this fact up. I couldn't get a clear answer. Likewise, with respect to the existence of the Catholic Church in Spain, that was the state, that was the confessional, that was the church, the official religion in Spain, at least until fairly recent history, and I can't seem to get a straight answer from the scholars who know stuff about this. So both Great Britain and Spain are to this day, I think, confessional states, but I have to check on Spain. All right. Finally, the critique of liberalism. Locke inaugurated the grand history of liberal politics. Hobbes had merely prepared the way, and without any clear idea that full-blown liberalism would follow upon his efforts. Right? He wasn't really concerned with that. He was concerned with law and order, political stability, things like that. The whole conception of liberalism rests on the priority of the individual over the community. The specific difficulty that arises is how liberal political philosophy can justify a state making great demands of its members up to military service, intense suffering, and possible violent death. And they have to make that demand, okay, because states go to war with one another. You follow? There's no way out of this objection. You have to face it, I'm saying. Maybe you can answer it, but you have to face it. Here's the difficulty. If the state exists for the individual, then when the state demands that means-end relationship be flipped, right? And now that the individual served the state, right? Then doesn't the individual have the right to disobey? Doesn't the individual have the right to say no? Okay. Look right at the draft board and say, I'm sorry, but you're representatives of the state, and the state exists for the individual, and I'm an individual, and therefore I can rightfully disobey your demand that I enter the army and fight on behalf of the state. Okay, that's a very serious theoretical difficulty, and it's one that attaches to all modern liberal states, basically everything we have now in the West. So a second concern often raised, though less often with the passage of time, is that liberalism is, as it were, false both morally and metaphysically. For if the highest end of our species is for the self, St. Thomas would make this objection, is for the self to surrender himself or herself to God, then political liberalism could be charged with flipping the natural order of creation upside down. For with liberalism, the free person endowed with conscience and possessed of a right to property would seem to own authority, not merely over the whole state. The first problem, it gets even worse, but even over God himself. Otherwise put, liberalism can appear to be a new religious form of worship, however camouflaged, in which the idols now are the person, his liberty of conscience, and his property. But all those, his liberty of conscience belongs to the very essence of his personality. His property is an orbit around him as a person. But this places the person over God, who is reduced to a menu choice opposite the free faculty of the private will. However, if there are solid grounds for believing that God exists, then straightway one is confronted with the duty to surrender one's will to one's maker. It makes no sense for the statue to wish to dominate the sculptor. And one is also confronted with the option to rebel. So too. So one may argue that Locke was the foremost practitioner of a species of philosophical rhetoric that knowingly donned the mask of reasonableness in order permanently to entrench the modern revolution begun by his predecessors, and now having effloresced in the form of moral individualism. The immediate result would be the culture of enlightenment. And I'll add a provocative note for you. My old advisor said that what we've been living through in the 20th century is the product of, in fact, the failure of enlightenment. But that would require further commentary. All right, folks. So hope that gave you a few things to think about, and I will be in touch soon.